It'd been scorching hot all day, so when the sun finally went down, we all breathed a sigh of relief. The dusk was met with the blasting of fireworks. The first boom sent skittish cats hiding, dogs shaking, howling. It felt like a war zone with all the smoke and bangs. However, the kaleidoscope of colors, the sparkling halos and spirals in the sky reminded us that this was a celebration. Red, white, and blue were the most popular that night. As it was the 4th of July, the neighborhood parties started to wind down. But my friends and I were too full of excitement to sleep. The coolness of the evening was calling to us. We piled into a car and took off. It was just after midnight. We had a few firecrackers left, but thought it best to go somewhere quiet and away from the prying eyes of our parents and their friends. We reached the outskirts of town. In the distance, we could see a parking lot by Blue Rock Spring Park. A welcome sight apart from one car. It was empty. However, just as we pulled in, I started to get a bad feeling. The lot had the air of someone just being there. A vehicle just where ours was, speeding away in the opposite direction. Then we noticed the passenger door was open. A man spilled out of his seat onto the ground. Our headlights washed over him, revealing red spools beneath and oozing wounds, one most notably on his jaw. My friend in the back seat let out a noise somewhere between terror and disgust. No, oh no, I repeated. The gear shifted to park, but my friend seemed frozen in his seat. My door flung open. He's dead. Shaking. Moving? No, he's alive. My eyes then traveled towards the driver's side. A head with poofy, light brown hair was smeared with blood. More blood was pouring out of a wound on her neck. At first, she appeared motionless behind the steering wheel. But suddenly, I heard sputtering, mumbling. Talking? Quick, go get help! My friend stared back at me blankly for a moment. Go! His car peeled off into the direction of Vallejo. Meanwhile, at a payphone just a few blocks away from the Vallejo Sheriff's Office, a call was placed. I want to report a double murder. If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find the kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye.
Hi, we're Kelly.
Molly?
And Bronwyn.
And welcome to This Might Be True, the podcast where we separate fact from film fiction. And today we're talking about the 2007 film by David Fincher, Zodiac. Molly, you started us with the most incredible, it's scary, the breakdown, because you've got the victims, but then you're ending with that call, which in the movie, the way the Zodiac says the goodbye is so chilling. And I was looking, I was like, I want to listen to the recording, but it doesn't exist. They didn't record 911 calls back then. So we'll never actually have the recording. And so we just have to rely on the woman the operator who actually responded to the call on her interpretation of what she heard. But the way it's done in the movie is like, ooh, it's chilling.
Goodbye.
So weird.
Molly, why don't you kick us off with the event? Talk to us about who is the Zodiac killer? Who is this mystery killer? And what do we know? Do we know who they are to this day? Who is this killer?
Well, we do not. I mean, there is no direct answer. It's considered like the most famous unsolved American crime. Now, The interesting thing about this crime is that we do have the letters, the ciphers. We do have phone calls. We do have someone who was taking credits for these crimes. So just to be clear, the Zodiac killer is directly linked to at least 5 murders in Northern California between 1968 to 1969. However, it's kind of hard to pinpoint because he did continue to kind of taunt police, make threats, and send letters from about 69 to 74 before abruptly ceasing communication. And it's through that communication, that correspondence, that he claimed to have killed as many as 37 people. It's kind of a tricky thing.
Creepy.
How many people is he even responsible for? Well, kind of the easy answer is 5, but, maybe as many as 37. And there's so many theories. It's such a fascinating case. I can see why people get really drawn into it and kind of obsessed with it. The mystery surrounding the murders has been the subject of numerous books. And of course, David Fincher's acclaimed film from 2007.
You know me, loving a tagline. I've always got to get the tagline. And it was so interesting because, you watch the film and then I read the tagline after. I'm like, yeah, this is what this film is about. The tagline is, there's more than one way to lose your life to a killer. And I thought that's a great tagline because it really does sum up. This is not about the Zodiac. It is about the people that got so caught up in it.
People do get fully commit their lives to this case. And I think it's interesting that the movie actually is partly about that level of obsession and how you get sucked into it.
I think it's fascinating with Graysmith because imagine you're a cartoonist, a political cartoonist, and then this case happens, and then it becomes really an obsession of his life. And he becomes a forefront, he's an expert really on all things Zodiac, more so than probably the police are. And he becomes, and the film itself, Graysmith is literally front and center. It's Jake Gyllenhaal plays him, and it's really about him and his kind of drive, his obsession into this case and what that does to his life.
He did write a book about the Zodiac, and that, I believe, is a big basis for the actual script. So Robert Graysmith was born in 1942. He was a former cartoonist for the Chronicle, and he became obsessed with the crime. He wrote the book in 86. And he even tried to decode the letters and just, over a 13-year period was totally drawn into this. And then along with him, we also have Paul Avery as another kind of leading character. He had a nickname, Unsavory Avery. And he also reported on the Zodiac, and he also later was a big part of the reporting on Patty Hearst kidnapping and trial. And he worked for decades at the San Francisco Chronicle, and they're kind of, again, the kind of center point of this film. And Avery himself was sent a Halloween card by the Zodiac, which is kind of creepy. And the card read, "From your secret pal, I feel it in my bones. You ache to know my name, and so I'll clue you in." But then inside said, "But then why spoil the game?"
Oh my God.
And so
Creepy.
it was a genuinely, scary time to be in San Francisco, I take it, and to be involved in this case publicly meant that you were becoming vulnerable. Even Graysmith himself said he was getting a lot of phone calls of just heavy breathing, particularly once he announced the book was coming out. No, there's no clear evidence of who was making those phone calls, but it does, seem like they were aware that he was working on the case, that Avery was working on it, and he wanted to reach out to these journalists, and that's creepy, man. He also did make some pretty strong threats too. He did say in some of these letters that he was going to go on a killing rampage if they didn't print it by certain times, which is kind of crazy. So in his first cipher, which was July 31st, 1969. So, dear editor, this is the murderer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl on the 4th of July near the golf course. To prove I killed them, I shall state some facts. So this was actually just the letter part of him being like, I did it. And then he says, here is part of a cipher and 2 other parts of this cipher are being mailed to the editors of the Vallejo Times and the San Francisco Examiner. I want you to print this cipher on the front page of your paper. In this cipher is my identity. Spoiler, it wasn't. And then he said, yeah, if you don't print it, I'm going to go on a rampage. So yeah, there were other newspapers he was sending it to as well. And it was kind of, I guess he wanted to be on the front page of as many as possible, essentially. I guess it was his motivation there.
Molly, why don't you tell us about the victims? Tell us about the ones that the Zodiac actually is attributed to.
Yes. Okay. So what's interesting is that Fincher does leave out what is considered to be one of the earlier murders. Again, like it could have gone back as far as 66 or even 67, but the starting point I was kind of finding was in 68, Betty Lou Jensen and David Arthur Faraday. They were the ones in Lover's Lane, and that is kind of generally considered the first kind of more, official one, although I don't think it's depicted in the film because Fincher said there were no witnesses, and he didn't want to try to recreate something that he wasn't really there for. But yes, they are considered to be, at least again, depending on who you ask, one of his earlier victims. And they were, again, at Lover's Lane. They had someone pull up when they're in this secluded area. And Betty Lou Jensen actually tried to run away, and she was shot 5 times in the back. And yeah, a vehicle pulled up, shoots into the back window, and the victims again tried to escape, but ultimately could not. And robbery did not seem to be a motive. It seemed to be, murder was the primary intent there. And then the one that the movie starts with is the murder of Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau. And that's the one that we see depicted. They too were kind of in a Lover's Lane area, again, a secluded parking lot. They had this guy drive up. He drove away, but they were kind of like, well, that was weird. And then again, pulls up, gets out. He had a light on his gun, which kind of disoriented them. I think Mike Mageau said he thought it was a cop going to ask him for his identification, and then he was caught really off guard, and he was shot. Darlene was shot. Both of them were apparently still alive and kind of, muttering, mumbling, but unfortunately Darlene succumbed to her injuries. Mike actually ended up surviving, even though he was shot several times. And this is the attack where you mentioned the phone call. This is where we have the first kind of contact between the police and the supposed Zodiac killer, as he came to be known. And it's in that phone call that he said, I want to report a double murder. And then he also says, I killed those kids last year, which is referring to Betty Lou Jensen that I mentioned earlier and David Faraday. So those were the kind of first two that created the pattern that there's this guy out there. He seems to be drawn to these Lover's Lane situations. But then he kind of broke his pattern, which is interesting because when it came to Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell, he showed up in a costume, things were quite escalated. He kind of seemed like it was a robbery, but then ended up stabbing both Cecilia and Brian during that event. And again, Cecilia succumbed to her injuries, but Brian survived. And then we also have the death of Paul Stein, the taxi cab driver, which also seems to have kind of broken the pattern in that the Zodiac apparently hailed a cab. The cab driver took him to this upscale residential area, and it was kind of a bang, 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 took his wallet and his keys and also apparently parts of his shirt, which was then sent to the police and various other publications as kind of evidence that, again, the Zodiac or whoever was writing these letters and claiming to be the Zodiac was responsible. Those are kind of the main proven ones. Kathleen Johnson, the mom with the baby, she had a weird kidnapping, almost murder, which is also attributed to him. But he took credit for it in 1970, but that seems to be one that's quite disputed. So I think those are the kind of primary 5 murders that we're dealing with here.
When you look at different serial killers, some have their MO and they have a way that you can attribute. But Zodiac operated in such a vast different, he used guns, he used knives. I mean, there's such a difference between shooting a taxi driver in the back of the head versus coming up in a full it's the outfit is so creepy that he wore. And the fact that we have a survivor to explain that to us, but the outfit is so creepy. It was like a hood, black hood, everything in black, the Zodiac print on the front, his like logo that he had, and the glasses. And then to say like it's going to be a robbery, and so you're sort of, making your
Yeah.
victim feel like, okay, maybe there's a chance if we just do, if we comply, we can survive. And then to suddenly just, nope, I'm just going to stab them, which is such a personal crime. I mean, you usually associate
Mm.
stabbing with like hate crime and personal hate crime. Obviously, because we don't know to this day exactly who Zodiac was, that it sort of stays in your memory as just such a creepy boogeyman, really.
Well, and I was looking up the Son of Sam last night because I was doing research for this and just thinking of that. Like, it creates such an atmosphere, like that you get a good sense of that in terms of the film, right? Seeing when he's like, I'm gonna drive you to school, and the kid's like, why am I not on the bus? And it's like, parents all around San Francisco were probably doing the same thing. And that was the Son of Sam thing, is that he was killing brunettes, like long-haired brunettes. So then like women in New York City were like, let me like cut my hair and dye my hair blonde. And I can appreciate when there isn't a set MO like that, it makes it that much more scary in terms of like who knows what where it could come from. You can't be like, well, I'm blonde, so it's fine, I'm not going to be targeted, if he's like
It's so
broadening
true.
his
And
net.
they have that moment in the film just before we have the murder of Holstein in the cab. They're calling into the radio and they're like, are you afraid of the Zodiac? No, he's just getting those kids and they're making it sound like it's and meanwhile, the film is showing us, a very busy downtown area and then into what is, I believe, was quite a nice area where the cab was stopped, and to have that murder take place right on the corner of that road, and he was seen. That's the crazy part. There's always this moment where you study any kind of serial killer where you're like, oh my God, they could have stopped them. Like that moment, they could have stopped them.
Well, and they really did get close to catching him. They really, again, what don't the police mess up? They often do in these cases. And they did apparently stop someone who would have fit the Zodiac's description, but the cops who pulled him over let him go because there'd been a misreport that it was a black subject. And they thought, oh, he's not black. So anyways, so there were some close calls in terms of maybe even actually catching him, and then they let him get away.
They actually, from what I remember, because someone had said black clothing and the dispatcher had misinterpreted it as a black subject, so they put that
Yes.
out. And then the cops are driving in towards the scene. They see this white suspect and they stop and they ask, oh, have you seen anything? And he's like, oh yeah, I saw someone with a gun going that way.
As you would if you were the guy that had just, you're like, first of all, totally not me. Second of all, go in that other wrong direction after a suspect that doesn't exist.
So the Zodiac in one of his letters did actually address that too. So in the one that started with, this is the Zodiac speaking, I'm the murderer of the taxi driver. And then he provided the bloodstained pieces of his shirt as evidence. And he said, the SF police could have caught me last night if they had searched the park properly, instead of holding road races with their motorcycles, seeing who could make the most noise. He was kind of annoyed almost
my
that they
God.
weren't working hard enough. And he said their drivers have just parked their cars and sat there quietly waiting for me to come out of cover. He really was taunting them in terms of like, y'all aren't doing your job well enough, otherwise you would have caught me. That does seem to be a pattern in his letters throughout the years that he was receiving them. So
well, it's an interesting impulse, right? Like you think that what you would do is like try to, execute these crimes in secret and then like never be caught and live in anonymity and have this like secret thing, and you're moving in the darkness. And then it seems like a very counter impulse to be like, I think what I need to do is first of all call and report myself and then start sending letters. And then there's like the weird layer of like, I want to communicate, I want to be caught, I guess. Is that not the impulse? And then at the same time to be like, but rather than just say, here's who I am, I'm going to make it into like a code. So it's like a game. Like it just seems, It's like this like 2 steps forward, 1 step back thing of like, I want people to know who I am, but I can't just like tell the cops. That would be too easy or like not fun. Like I don't really, it's an interesting motivation.
Well, you would even be like, have you figured out my cipher yet? Like, come on, people. And you kind of was say, if you can figure out the cipher, you'll figure out who I am. But, here we are in 2025. And even though they have cracked some of the ciphers, even as recent as like 2020, there is still no clear indication of who he is. Like, I think that maybe he was bullshitting because he wanted them to play along with his game,
And it wasn't even the police that figured out the first cipher, was it? It was a
Mm-hmm.
couple. I guess they
Teachers.
had
Yeah.
they had an eye for this sort of thing. They broke the first Zodiac's code.
And some of these would not have been connected had it not been for the letters connecting them, right? I don't know if he would have been known as a serial killer had it not been for him trying to connect the dots for us through the
And then I think it's
correspondence.
almost debatable, like you can have the argument that these aren't connected. This maybe wasn't even the same person. Like having the letters connects them, and then the cops were like, okay, perfect, and like let's put all these, then you have a person to be guilty of crimes that you maybe haven't solved. And also he was claiming, whoever was doing this communication was like claiming, like you said, up to like what, 36, like that's you're like, who's to say if this is or isn't. Like, that's the interesting thing about the shifting MO as well. I mean, for the sake of the Fincher film, he is obviously taking the, case as like, these are the actual murders. And we're sort of assuming that it's one person doing it. Although the film is clever because it focuses more on that like fixation, like the quest. So this is paraphrased, a statement that is famously by a criminologist, James Allen Fox. But the quote is, with widespread social and cultural changes in the 60s and 70s, drug use, hitchhiking, the hippie movement, and anti-establishment sentiment, conditions were prime for predators to go on the prowl. Which is interesting in terms of the context of San Francisco, because Summer of Love was 1967. So that was like just beforehand. You had this like massive influx into especially like that Northern California, San Francisco, greater San Francisco area. But the sort of nature of it being California, especially in terms of being this like destination, San Francisco specifically, to have violence in the location of this city of love and hippiness. The 60s, there was like I would say an underlying vibration of violence because you have all these big assassinations happening as well. So like JFK was assassinated in 1963. That was like the beginning of that string of assassinations. 1968 was MLK and was also RFK. So that's sort of like in the mix of these murders happening in San Francisco, 68 into 69. In the background is also the Vietnam War. April 1968, that was the Democratic National Conventions in Chicago that erupted into violence. And also 1969 was Stonewall riots beginning in New York City. That was June 1969. And then August, so the threat that Zodiac makes about where he's going to start shooting, it's like over the weekend, he says, I'm going to start picking off lone people. If he had actually acted on that, which he didn't, but if he had, that would have been right before, because the Manson Tate murders were August 9th, 1969. August 10th, 1969, that was the La Bianca murders. August 15th, 1969 was Woodstock.
Wow.
So
what a year.
Yeah.
I was thinking about it today. I'm like, it's not a rewatch value film. It's a good film, but it's not something you'd be like, well, I got to watch that again. Because it is quite long. So it runs at 2 hours and 37 minutes, which is like really long considering that this film came out in 2007, which...
And it has like kind of a bit of a weird like pacing.
It has extremely
like
weird pacing because it runs from 1969. So you got the opens. I mean, you get an aerial view of like, July 4th fireworks, and then we are in a point of view shot in the car, which I find really fascinating because when you're watching it, you almost think like, are we with the Zodiac right now? Are we hunting? Are we prowling? And it's like, actually, no, these are victims that are, about to meet him and lose, well, one of them will lose her life. And the pacing is really interesting because it spans from 1969 to 1978. There seems to be an emphasis on 69, 71, and then kind of 1978-ish. So it kind of goes from like, it's like the murders, and then it's hours later, week later, month later, and then you kind of jump, and then suddenly it's 1971, and then it's like that the latter half of the film is just like, it's a good 8 years, 7, 8 years that just sort of span. And I realized because I always watch mine with closed captions, and the closed captions were covering a lot of the titles of like down the bottom of the times. So when I went back, I made like on my second viewing, I was like, I'm going to make a note of like the times. And I'm like, wow, that is quite, it's like 1 month later, 2 weeks. One of them's like 12 hours later. So it's like goes from like 12 hours later, 2 weeks, 1 year. One of them just jumps a year randomly. And then it's like, suddenly it's 1978. So I think that's quite jarring to the viewer. Well, not necessarily jarring because I think they did a really good job with it, but I do think it makes you feel quite detached from the whole experience as a viewer. It's chaotic, and I think it really deliberately did that, where you get a sense of the chaos of the case. It was just kind of kept going on, and sometimes you get pulled back in with another letter, and and then it would kind of keep going on again. So, it's really fascinating for that.
Yeah, because like I feel like the film in that way mimics what it would have been like to have been following it. And you get, as a viewer, almost like an uneasy feeling, because I think usually with well, depending on the film, like there are crazy art films that are like out of the box, but like with, a conventional Hollywood film, you have like a sense of momentum. And then you're like, okay, I can feel that we've passed the climax, we're wrapping things up now. Like it's sort of like little fits and starts with this. And I appreciate that is what the actual case was like. So it's very interesting. Yeah, I feel like Fincher did a good job of making you feel the way these characters would have felt. Characters and also the corresponding real life people themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah, instead of that kind of, you don't have that sense of like, okay, big murder. Now the cops are getting closer. Oh, they've almost got him. Oh, maybe he gets away once, and then it's all wraps up, and you have that sense of like conclusion.
He doesn't sensationalize. If you're a David Fincher fan, you've watched Seven and you've watched Fight Club, and you're thinking, oh my God, he's going to do this film on Zodiac, you were not going to get what you think you were going to get. And so he did an interview with Sight and Sound, and he addressed the film's like low gross at the North American box office. He said, even with the box office being what it is, I still think that there's an audience out there for this movie. Everyone has a different idea about marketing, but my philosophy is that if you market a movie to 16-year-old boys and don't deliver Saw or Seven, they're going to be the most vociferous ones coming out of the screening saying this movie sucks. And you're saying goodbye to the audience who would get it, because they're going to look at the ads and say, I don't want to see some slasher movie. So it's really interesting because like he really didn't want to make the sensational Zodiac killer. His whole idea about it was to make a story about the lives of the people that were trying to find this killer and and how that really destroyed a lot of their lives. And I think he did a really good job on it, because when you really think about where you start, and you've got your Paul Avery character. So you've got Paul Avery played by Robert Downey Jr., who at this point, this is 2007, so this is not 2008, which is Iron Man. So Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr. is very different. So anyone who doesn't know Robert Downey's kind of career, he had a lot of drug and alcohol addiction, spent some time in prison, and so he had kind of come in and out of the movies. A lot of them wouldn't insure him for a long period of time, so he had quite a struggle getting back into his career. I mean, even Jon Favreau had to really fight to get him cast for Iron Man, which is crazy to think about it now, because he is like the
I didn't know that.
The star model that really pushed the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, into what it became. But yeah, so it's really interesting, and he does such a great job at this kind of fall of a character, because what Paul Avery goes through. I mean, from being the crime journalist for the Chronicle to receiving these threats that are threats upon his life, to his colleagues wearing buttons that say, I am not Paul Avery, because they all know he's getting threatened. And eventually him leaving, and he went to go work for, like, I think they mentioned it in the film, like San Francisco Bee or something like that. And it's kind of seen as quite a demoted type trajectory.
Yes, the Sacramento Bee. There you
Sacramento
go.
Bee. Yeah, there's sort of when Jake Gyllenhaal's character Robert Graysmith goes to meet the new person, because Graysmith had created quite a good dynamic with Avery on this whole Zodiac mystery. But of course, Avery leaves, and then someone else comes in, and he sort of tries to be chummy with him like he did with Avery, and it doesn't quite work. And there's a bit of a kind of comment about, oh yeah, what a trajectory to go to the Sacramento Bee. It's very clear that he's gone sort of down in his career. And then when we do see him later in the film, he is clearly in the depths of some kind of alcoholism or something. And I do believe he died quite young at like 66 or something. So,
Well, isn't it true that they weren't actually working at the same time together? Isn't this like a Fincher?
Paul Avery claimed that he had no contact with Graysmith until they both left the Chronicle years later. And Avery said he actually only met Graysmith twice, and he was apparently not very impressed by Graysmith's book. So they do kind of fictionalize, but I know they also, people who were close with Paul Avery, they seem to think that him being depicted in poor health and kind of as a recluse, obsessed with the killings, those close to him have said that that was kind of inaccurate, that maybe they exaggerated his downfall a little bit for the movie. And I wonder if that has to do again with Robert Downey Jr. being the one behind the performance, the collaboration and the chumminess in the office. But it makes sense, right? Like you want to, create some connection between these characters. So I can see why for creative reasons they would have gone with that. And obviously, I guess that wouldn't have been really supported by Graysmith's book. That would have been a creative liberty that Fincher would have taken, I guess.
Exactly. And you needed that dynamic because you need that. You need something to hold the viewer in. And so having that kind of that duo, and then when that duo shifts, it goes from like Graysmith in the film, it goes from Graysmith with Avery to Graysmith with Toschi. And then and it just ends up with Graysmith all by himself, really. And that I think by that point in the film, he's quite like deep into his obsession. He's like lost his wife. Not lost her, she's left of her own volition because of his obsession, and probably the creepy phone calls that were potentially from the Zodiac with the just like heavy breathing. Mark Ruffalo plays Inspector David Toschi, which is the San Francisco police inspector who worked, I don't remember how long he worked the case. It was like a good amount of years, and he had quite the downfall. He ended up getting demoted because they believed at some point that he was writing these like it was the way they sort of explained it, he was writing these like not fan fiction, but fan mail, but not from himself, but about himself. And then they thought that maybe he had been responsible for the 1978 Zodiac letter that showed up randomly all of a sudden and mentioned him personally in the letter. So he ended up losing his career, really. He got taken off the homicide squad. What's really interesting is that Fincher actually very early in the casting spoke with Jennifer Aniston. They were talking about actors that she had worked with, and she mentioned how much she had enjoyed working with Jake Gyllenhaal on The Good Girl and Mark Ruffalo in Rumor Has It. So she seems to have had some kind of sway in at least David Fincher's, like, who he would maybe cast.
Way to go, Jennifer Aniston.
So for the research, Ruffalo read every report on the case, read all the books on the subject, met Toschi, and found that he had perfect recall of all the details that had happened, the when, the where, the who, and even what he was wearing. He always knew what he was wearing, and Ruffalo said, I think it seared into who he is, and it was a big deal for him. For Gyllenhaal, he met Graysmith and actually videotaped to study his mannerisms and behavior. Supposedly, Fincher has a very exacting way and perfectionist way of directing, and some scenes, it said, were required of upward of 70 takes, and Gyllenhaal was supposedly quite frustrated by this. It sort of said, like, there has to be a stopping point at which you go, that's what we have to work with. Downey said, there were times that he wanted to garrote him, but, he wanted to give him what he wanted, and Downey said, I think I'm the perfect person to work for him because I understand gulags. That's what he said, which obviously is his like reference to his own time in prison and his own situation. But, Ruffalo defended the director's methods and said, the way I see it, when you enter into someone else's world as an actor, you can put your expectations aside and have an experience that's new and pushes and changes you, or hold on to what you think it should be and have a stubborn, immovable journey that's filled with disappointment and anger, which makes me wonder what was going on in that set.
Wow. Do you know how long it took them to finish the movie then? Like, how long was the production?
It wasn't actually that long. So the filming dates, principal photography began on September 12, 2005. They shot for 5 weeks in the San Francisco Bay Area, the rest of the time in LA, bringing the film in under budget, wrapping in February 2006. It was a 115-day shoot. So it was not an arduous shoot by any means. So in terms of the production, so James Vanderbilt did the screenplay and he read the book while in high school, and he actually grew up around that area, and he decided to pursue it and pitched an adaptation of his screenplay to Phoenix Pictures. And David Fincher was like first choice director based on his work on Seven. And Fincher was really drawn to the story because he grew up in San Anselmo in Marin County during the initial murders. When it came to the actual film, he interviewed people who were directly involved in the case. So, they spent months interviewing witnesses, family members of suspects, retired and current investigators, 2 surviving victims, and the mayors of San Francisco and Vallejo. Fincher said, even when we did our own interviews, we would talk to 2 people. One would confirm some aspects of it and another would deny it. Plus, so much time had passed, memories are affected, and the different telling of the stories would change perception. So when there was any doubt, we always went with the police reports. And it does say at the beginning of the film in the title that this is based on police files, and they were really adamant about that. And this was what I found really interesting, because when I was watching the film, I had not gone into my research deliberately, so I didn't know who was a survivor and who was not. And I remember when I was watching the scene of the murders at Lake Berryessa, there's like so much dialogue happening, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, how would you know that that's how someone responded? That's a lot to assume. And then I realized when I was doing my research, I was like, oh my gosh, he's a survivor. He survived that horrific assault, which was like, I can't even imagine living with the trauma of that. So what was interesting is when Fincher made the film, he said that he only depicted murders for which there were witnesses or no surviving victims.
Yes, that's why I said Betty Lou Jensen. We don't see that one, right? Even though that is kind of considered, again, it's hard to say what is the first, depending on what we believe or not. I also read a USA Today quote that Fincher said he can remember the police escorting his school bus when he was a kid. And he said, I know what it's like to be afraid of your neighbors.
Oh my gosh. It would stay with you, wouldn't it? And that's the thing. I think Fincher, when he was making this film, I saw a quote, I can't remember where it was, but it was saying like he probably knew more about the case than anyone else. Like they were in the case file. They were reading the case files. They were speaking with Gray Smith, reading the book, doing everything like that. So, and then also speaking with the survivors themselves to get the actual like memory down. They actually hired a private investigator to track down real-life survivor Michael Mageau. So I guess he did not want to be found easily, but they did find him. And Toschi, actual real-life Toschi, watched the film several times and said, I thought Ruffalo did a good job. But the film did remind him of old frustrations that the case was never closed. And so Mike Mageau and Brian Hartnell, the 2 survivors that we see in the film, they were actually consultants. And Brian Hartnell, who survived Lake Berryessa, the attack at Lake Berryessa, he actually appears as an extra alongside with his wife in the background of the scene where Marty Lee suggests to David Toschi that he takes some time off work. Which, if you remember, he takes some time off work to go to the cinema to go watch Dirty Harry, which is based on.
And then it's inspired by the Zodiac.
I don't know if that's relaxing.
That is a great moment.
I like that the promotion for it, that Paramount actually posted on light poles in major cities original sketches of the actual Zodiac killer with the words in theaters March 2nd at the bottom. And then when at the opening logos for the film, so it was Paramount Pictures and Warner Brothers, and they actually used the ones that were from the 70s at the opening of the film. And the soundtrack was really interesting because, so Fincher actually wanted it to be like composed of 40 cues of vintage music spanning nearly 3 decades. Within, and that's a big change in music. And he didn't actually want originally a score but he wanted a tapestry of sound, vintage songs of the period, sound bites, and clips of KFRC and advertisements from Matthews Top of the Hill Daily City, which was a prominent local consumer electronics dealership of the time. He told the studio that he didn't need a composer, he'd purchase all the rights to the various songs instead, and they agreed. But as the film developed, the sound designer, Ryan Cleese, he felt that some scenes really should have used original music, and he inserted music from one of his favorite soundtracks, which was David Shire's score for The Conversation. So it's very interesting in terms of the music that was used, because there's not a lot. It's quite quiet, that film. When you watch it, it doesn't have a very loud soundtrack playing throughout. Costumes were really interesting because they actually meticulously recreated costumes from forensic evidence that was lent to the production. So I know that in the very first scene, she's wearing like a sort of like a jump pantsuit, I think, and that was taken from her actual, like, what she was wearing. And I don't know this article, like this name, it's called Banff Style, but I thought it was really interesting because it mentioned that before informality in the American workplace became commonplace with phenomena like casual Fridays, Zodiac depicts Paul Avery as eschewing sartorial norms with offbeat office wear that grows increasingly chaotic as the investigation into the Zodiac killer begins to take even more of a personal toll. I watched it back, and it's true. He starts with like kind of a corduroy jacket type thing, and by the end of it, I think he's in a robe. I think he's like,
when he's in the boat. Yeah.
He's completely, and then like right before he leaves the Chronicle, he's wearing very like the most casual clothing. I was like, I would never have actually put that together.
I was really taken by the tonalities. I really like the cinematography. And I think I read it on like Reddit or like a YouTube comment, but someone was like, the color yellow is really emphasized. And I think it starts to get more prevalent kind of the closer that Graysmith is getting to maybe identifying the killer, I think was the theory that I read on that. But I definitely noticed watching it the second time that I was like, there's a lot of yellow in this movie. And like, we do associate like sepia tones with the 70s. So
it is muted tones.
Well.
Yeah, so the cinematographer was Harris Savides, who did The Game, Elephant, and The Bling Ring. So
I was gonna say, I know that name. I thought it sounded familiar. And he passed away like right after in post-production on the Bling Ring. Yeah.
So Fincher had worked with him on Seven. He shot opening credits. So he did the opening credits of Seven, which I have not seen Seven in a long time, so I don't know what the opening credits look like, but he did the opening credits of Seven, and he did the film The Game. And Savides loved the script, but realized there was so much exposition, just people talking on the phone or having conversations. It was difficult to imagine how it could be done in a visual way. So Fincher and Savides did not want to repeat the look of Seven. The director's approach to Zodiac was to create a look mundane enough that audiences would accept that what they were watching was the truth. The filmmakers also did not want to glamorize the killer or tell the story through his eyes. That would have turned the story into a first-person shooter video game. We didn't want to make the sort of movie that serial killers would want to own, Fincher said. And then I looked it up because
that's an interesting comment.
Yeah, I know. And it works. Like, it's true. Like, no one would look at that film and think, serial killers, awesome. You're kind of left with like you're left with more questions than answers. And what you get glimpses of as whoever this kind of figure could be, it's not a positive thing. It's nothing. It's chaotic, it's unresolved, it's unsettling, but and sort of lacks any kind of satisfaction at the end of the film, but it works for that because it's just like the real case. In 2024, Netflix came out with This Is the Zodiac Speaking, which basically highlights entirely Arthur Lee Allen, who was one of the suspects of Zodiac. In this, the Seawater siblings discuss growing up with Arthur Lee. He was a teacher who became a family friend, and they ended up sort of piecing together so many places that they had been with him that were actual murder scenes and their own experiences, that they come to the conclusion that they believe he was the Zodiac. And so, if you're interested in looking at Arthur Lee Allen as a suspect, that does have Robert Graysmith is also interviewed in that, as are other people. So it's got quite an interesting history of that particular person as an alleged suspect, or as a suspect.
And I
of
read
the
that
killer.
that moment between him and Arthur Lee Allen at the hardware store is how they do it in the movie, and they kind of like stare each other down. That is very similar to actual events. Graysmith claims that he went to the hardware store, and it wasn't in the store like we see in the movie. They were actually in the parking lot in their cars, and they drove up. Allen drove up next to him in the parking lot, blocking the driver car door, and this two stared at each other
Creepy.
in this eerie kind of
No,
connection.
thank you.
And yeah, Graysmith definitely, he definitely, points towards him pretty strongly.
Yeah.
And that is something he's being criticized for, not just like in terms of this movie, but his book that he wrote. And that, there were other suspects. I mean, there was like this group called Case Breakers. That's like a bunch of retired military and police officers. They thought they found the suspect.
But it's all circumstantial evidence. Yeah. They just don't have the hard evidence to point to any one particular person. What I will say about that particular docuseries, this is the Zodiac speaking, what was interesting is that, so the siblings, when they started to, David C. Waters said he actually spoke with Arthur Lee Allen, and Arthur Lee confessed to him not just about that, but some other horrific things that he had done to the children growing up. And it caused a bit of a separation within the family dynamic, and the siblings didn't talk to each other for quite a period of time. But then they all went and saw the 2007 film Zodiac, and afterwards reconnected because things that were brought up in the film triggered memories in them, and they started to piece their own memories together. And I thought that was so interesting that the film itself lends into. So if you're interested in the Zodiac and Arthur Lee Allen and anything to do with that, then I do recommend the docuseries. This is the Zodiac.
Love that, like the power of cinema to unlock your own memories.
We talked about one of the ciphers, being deciphered in 2020, but there's still some that haven't been. There's still, and I mean, will they ever
and that was
provide
no easy
answers?
feat.
No.
That took them I did a little bit of a deep dive on that, because it was like these mathematicians / YouTubers that kind of collaborated, and they had to work through 650,000 different combinations to crack it. So really it was only possible with the technology of today to even begin the process.
Because with the first one,
deciphering. Yeah.
The first one that the math teachers, they figured out just that they looked at the double consonants of al, and of course they assumed the word kill will be mentioned in here, and they were kind of able to work backwards from that. But obviously with other difficulty, I'm sure it's not as simple as we got it, it would have taken, but it only took them. It was I don't actually know. I remember in the film it actually tells you they get the letter, and then it's however many hours later, it's 12 hours later, and you see them at their kitchen, and it literally mentions their name, and it's breakfast nook or something. It's the most domestic space that these, oh hun, you should check this out. She's okay, it's completely nonchalant. I mean, they're gonna go and crack this first Zodiac letter. It's interesting, but yeah, what a time to be alive, which we weren't, and I'm kind of grateful for it, because that sounds really scary. Yeah, just like a killer running around. And it's always those, anything now, they're we lived in a safe town and we didn't even lock our doors. I'm lock your doors, people.
I think, that's a total tangent, but I think there was a Richard Ramirez case where it was he did try, he would just show up in people's houses, but that, he tried a door and it was locked, and then he was okay, never mind. It was somebody say either
Richard
was
Ramirez
saved by locking it, or it
me.
was
He terrifies me because his victims literally were from children to elderly women. He had no he just was driven by this horrific compulsion. So killers like that just terrify, and they terrify us because they're so beyond what's normal, expected behavior of a human being, and they dive into this perverse, terrifying thing, and there's no answer. And because we don't have an answer, we desire an answer because then we'll feel safe. If we can answer it, then we can fix it. But if we don't have an answer, then it just remains. And that's Zodiac. It remains a mystery, and it lets us feed so much into it that it becomes bigger than anything else. And what the film shows us is really at the heart of it, it's quite a mundane existence of having to figure out files and years and decades, and and we have no answer. All of that time, all that obsession, all of the things that they lost, and they still don't know who did it. It's It's such there's more than one way to lose your life to a killer, as the tagline says, and I think that really sums it
Yeah,
up.
exactly.
All right, well, thank you for joining us today. If you have any suggestions for films that we should discuss in upcoming episodes, you can email us at thismightbetruepodcast@gmail.com or comment below. You can also find us on social media at This Might Be True Podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast, and if you feel so inclined, leave us a 5-star review. And join us next time to find out what else might be true.